I remember my Uncle George, husband of my mother's only sister Aunt Sadie, better than my mother's three brothers because we lived only 7 or 8 blocks from Uncle George, Aunt Sadie and their 4 daughters. I'll give you a glimpse of Uncle George's family by describing a Sunday afternoon when my mother suggested to Dad that we walk over to visit with Sadie and George for a little while. I grabbed my coat, anxious to be with my cousin Norma, who was only 11 months older. As we walked along Division Street toward the Erickson house, I wondered if one of the older girls' boyfriends might be there, or if the girls would be playing carom, a game played on a wooden game board with pockets in each corner similar to the game of pool, but played with wood rings flicked with your index finger or middle finger. A game causing mild pain when I played it, I recall. But I wished I had some sisters to play with at my house. I wondered also if Aunt Sadie had baked pies and might offer us a piece as she often did. However, nearing their porch we heard the sound of several voices loudly arguing. Dad frowned. "Oh no, George's relatives are here," he said. George's mother had immigrated from Germany and still spoke with an accent. I believe Peter Erickson, George's father, had come from Sweden, settling in Illinois where George was raised as a child. Both parents by nature were excitable and loud, as were their 3 sons and 2 daughters. They seemed to enjoy expressing their strongly held opinions in ear-assaulting decibels of sound. With their impatience for listening to one another, everyone seemed to be shouting emotionally at once. The 3 brothers, George, John, and Butch, closely resembled one another in appearance. They were around 6 feet tall, broad-chested, and muscular, with round faces, dimples, wide smiles, and ears which flared out slightly from their heads. When they were in their 50s or 60s with balding heads but boyish faces, they reminded me somehow of 3 elves grown tall. All 3 brothers were in the building trade, as their father had been later in life. Grace and Mabel, George's sisters, were attractive women with nicely shaped figures. After a noisy evening like that, though, the quiet atmosphere at our house didn't seem so bad, even without sisters or relatives visiting often. Ordinarily, though, the Erickson household was fairly peaceful despite having 4 children. Uncle George loved his 4 daughters and always had a warm greeting for me. With his rich bass voice he loved to hum and sing. I remember him often rocking in his favorite rocker while singing or humming the melody if he forgot the words. He especially loved Traunerei by Schumann and Schubert's Serenade. Many times he would hold Norma, his youngest, on his lap while rocking and singing. I recall Uncle George pulling Norma onto his lap until she was 12 or 13 years old and became just too heavy. How I wished my dad, who liked good music but couldn't sing on key, could sing like that, or at least would hold me and rock in a rocker. If he ever did, I didn't remember it. Uncle George was a shameless bragger about his girls, and often about other things. He would say, "Oh, you should see my rhododendron. They are beautiful this year." Or, "The house I'm building is going to be beautiful." He always constructed several bird houses or bird apartment houses, installing them in his yard wherever they lived. Uncle George loved birds. In fact, if he caught a cat running after his birds, he would grab his BB gun. Likewise, he was quick to use his BB gun to scare off male dogs who came around when Mitzi, his Airedale, was in heat. Perhaps Uncle George was kinder to trespassing dogs after he was baptized into the Sunnyside Seventh-day Adventist Church, but I doubt it. After our family had attended weekly Bible studies at the Ericksons' house, which were given by Pearl Stafford, Dean of Nurses at Portland Adventist Hospital, several in our 2 families accepted Jesus and were baptized, except for my dad and my cousins Vera and Ethel, who were too busy dating to become interested, though Ethel was later baptized with her husband, Philip Wilt. After becoming a Christian, Uncle George added the hymn, "Beneath the Cross of Jesus," to those he'd sing as he rocked in his chair. Uncle George had a sense of humor and a hearty laugh, But one morning on his way to a plastering job, he was more irritated than amused as he looked in the rearview mirror of his truck and observed Mitzi standing in the truck bed with his equipment. Their Airedale dog had decided to go for a ride with Uncle George, but he decided to teach her a lesson she would remember. At full speed, Uncle George zigzagged from one side of the street to the other side, while poor Mitzi braced herself with her forelegs spread apart to keep her balance while swaying back and forth in the truck. Uncle George laughed until tears came to his eyes and his shoulders shook every time he told about how funny Mitzi looked and how happy she was to jump out when he circled back to take her home before going on to his plastering job. Occasionally, I stayed overnight at the Erickson house and had breakfast there. Uncle George would sometimes say, with a twinkle in his eye, "Eat your mush, Marilyn. It sticks to your ribs." Or at lunch, "Peanut butter is good for you. It sticks to your ribs." Aunt Sadie chuckled while she served us, while I wondered if I really wanted peanut butter on my ribs. Uncle George liked to tease, but I was there one Sunday morning when he looked dead serious and frightened. It was December 7th, 1941. Uncle George was listening to their console radio in the corner of the living room. Suddenly he shouted, "Come quick, everybody. Listen to this." We stood in shocked silence, hearing that the Japanese Navy had bombed our planes in Pearl Harbor. Uncle George's brother John had been a soldier near the end of the First World War, but at 12 years old I didn't realize the full implication. Yet I could see fear on everyone's face. The world would never be the same again. Erickson's second daughter, Ethel, who may have been standing with us by the radio, was soon to be married to her high school sweetheart, George Christensen. During the war, his ship, the USS Spence, was to go down in a typhoon and his life was lost. About 1942, Uncle George and Aunt Sadie moved to the west side of Portland, and we no longer could walk over to see them and their 4 girls. Uncle George had been plastering homes for a builder, George Grace, including George and Mr. Grace's own new home on the corner of Southwest 35th and Comus. Uncle George was attracted to the natural beauty of the wooded area with its tall fir trees and ferns. Comus was only a dirt and gravel road at the time, but George told Sadie he bought some plans for a home he would build for them, opposite George Grace's house on the southwest corner of 35th and Comus. Having been raised in the Midwest, George was a farmer at heart and could scarcely wait to plant and graft fruit trees, to plant a garden, and naturally, he would build birdhouses for the birds and install a bird bath. Uncle George's dad, Peter, came out in his old truck one day to help him cut brush and saw down trees to prepare for building. That afternoon, Peter grew tired and drove away before George was ready to leave. A few minutes later, Uncle George heard a siren on Barber Boulevard. Knowing his dad was getting older and not as careful driving, George felt apprehensive. Dropping his axe, he jumped into his truck and found that what he had feared was indeed true. There on the highway sat his dad's crumpled truck. His lunchbox and some prunes he had picked on the property were strewn over the pavement, but his body had been taken away by the ambulance. Nevertheless, George finished the nice 4 or 5 bedroom home and they moved in. Since Uncle George was a conscientious craftsman, most everything was good quality, including hardwood floors. Being an excellent plasterer, his ceilings were always brocaded beautifully and drop-coved in the style of the 40s. Aunt Sadie always did the painting, staining and wallpapering, along with caring for her family and sewing tailor-made quality clothing for the girls and for herself. Uncle George decided it would be economical to have a milk cow. He named her Daisy and cared for her as a pet, but Daisy, unfortunately, didn't produce much milk. "What can I do with her?" thought George. "I just can't bear to sell her to a slaughterhouse, and she can't be sold as a milk cow." Then George got an idea. During the war, bathtubs were in short supply along with many other things, and he had an extra bathtub among his building supplies. Uncle George placed an ad in the newspaper. Bathtub and cow both for $75. A newspaper reporter was so intrigued by this curious ad he came to the house and interviewed George following this, writing an article about Daisy and the tub which was published in the newspaper. The ad brought results and a man bought Daisy and the bathtub. Later, though, he tried to return Daisy to George but was told, "A deal is a deal." When Ethel had married, Uncle George cleared more property along unimproved Comas Street and built the newlyweds a little house. Then when Vera married about 2 years later, he built a house on the street for her. So Ethel and Vera were living close to their parents and sisters when their husbands left to serve in the U.S. Navy during the war. Within a few years, Uncle George realized that, with only 2 girls left at home, their house was larger than they needed, and he could make a profit selling it. He then built a smaller home further up Comas Street to the west. In 1967, Jackson High School had been built on Southwest 35th close to Comas, with George Grace having sold the land adjoining his house to the city on condition that he could select the presidential name, Andrew Jackson, and by 1991 Comas was extended many blocks westward to accommodate a large home development on previously virgin, forested property. Thus is progress, whether we like to see lovely, old trees come down or not. With her sister Sadie living on the west side of Portland in the early 1940s, Mother became more unhappy than ever that Dad hadn't moved us from our little rented house on this uninteresting, flat east side of town, as Other called it. Finally, by 1947, we moved into our large, newly built home on Southwest Barber Boulevard with a view of the river, and closer to Aunt Sadie and Uncle George. However, although the Erickson family remained on the west side, they moved to another new house every few years as George built a new one and sold the one they'd lived in. They lived in 3 more houses and a duplex which George built near Lesser Road. On the property of their last house that was on Southwest Roger Road off Lesser, he had built a large garage off to one side for storage. Years later, Aunt Sadie was to have it remodeled into a cute little house for Grandma Susan when she became 90 years old and had to move from Tualatin. In 1964, after 2 long years suffering with cancer, while Aunt Sadie tenderly nursed him in the last house he built, on Roger Road, Uncle George's strong heart gave up so that his once husky, now skeletal, body could rest in peace. Although worn out from nursing George, compassionate Aunt Sadie had the garage house remodeled, and then she painted the 3-room cottage for her ailing mother. With Bessie's help, she moved Grandma Susan from Tualatin with many of her flowers and plants. But a year or so later, Aunt Sadie took Grandma into her own house and cared for her until Grandma died at 96 years of age in May of 1970. Though the Rogers Street house George built for his family has been torn down when the neighborhood was completely transformed into a large subdivision of beautiful new homes in 1990, most of the homes George built are still standing and occupied by other families. When I drive by them, I think of the enthusiasm in Uncle George's voice when he said, "You should see the beautiful house I'm building." In the Bible, Isaiah 65 verse 21, we read that in the earth God shall make new. They shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. No sickness, no death. How perfectly contented Uncle George will be